For joining us for our first live event, I believe, our first live talk since the Christmas party. And the same speaker, different topic, a topic that maybe some of us were hoping we wouldn't have to talk about, but turns out we do. Topic of tariffs. Our speaker is Keith Weiner, the CEO and founder of Monetary Metals. Keith, thank you for joining us, and everybody join me in welcoming Keith Weiner.
Thanks, Ravi. You always have to be careful in speaking to an objectivist audience on an economic topic because these issues all have a moral dimension. And I think objectivists want to hear the economists say this policy is moral or this policy is immoral. So I'll start off by saying that tariffs are immoral. Objectivism holds that the immoral is impractical. Tariffs are impractical. Unfortunately, there are too many students of the philosophy, especially younger ones, who think, okay, that's it. We said it's immoral. We said that, therefore it's impractical. And therefore, we're done. Does anybody have any questions? The problem is that never satisfies anybody in any kind of argument or discussion. They want to understand the actual practicalities or impracticalities, and they want to understand the economics of it. And that's where economics as a field comes in. Economics is the field, I'll give an informal definition. Economics is the field that studies coordination. People want to be productive. People, as we know from philosophy, need to produce the values that life requires. Unless we're talking about a bare subsistence living, such as a savage would have had maybe 10,000 years ago, production involves coordination because we have specialization and division of labor. This is Adam Smith stuff 250 years ago. Economics formally wrote this down. And so the question is, okay, what are the requirements for coordination and what kinds of policies either foster coordination or unfortunately create discoordination or render it impossible for people to coordinate. And so something I addressed a lot in my dissertation is this idea that whenever government intrudes into the economy in any way, shape, or form, I looked at a dozen different ways, it always and necessarily causes discoordination, which means you have one group over here of people that are ready, willing, and able to produce something. You have a group over here that would like that something and be happy to pay for it, and yet somehow they're kept apart. When I talk about this, I prove this in my dissertation using spreads. So that leads us to, I was talking to somebody before I started speaking on camera, that there's kind of a false alternative understanding of what's wrong with the world today, or one of the issues that plagues the world. And tariffs are a bad and dishonest attempt to do evil, to correct for one side of the false alternative. The false alternative is either that unlimited trade deficits are perfectly fine, or that trade deficit is a ripoff of some sort, to use Trump's term, and that has to be corrected by government action, forceful, authoritarian government action, or whatever it takes, if necessary. Everybody loves to use the concept of bazooka in these types of circles, that the government is a bazooka and they're waving it around, threatening who they're going to shoot with it. Apropos to this topic, I saw a political cartoon, which I think I shared to Facebook yesterday or today, I lose track of when. And it shows, Trump with the tariffs, firing the bazooka at China, and it actually fires backwards and kills an American. So as a practical matter, there's actually controversy over what direction tariffs fire at. And we'll talk about that. There should never be controversy over the facts. Maybe controversy over the theory to explain the facts, maybe potentially controversy over the policy, but there shouldn't be a controversy over the fact itself. And yet, in the case of tariffs, even just at the mechanical level, there's a controversy, which just shows how deeply tribal people's have become, and their thinking has become very tribal. Red is right, blue is wrong, to use the U.S. Party colors. And And anything that the Republicans are doing, therefore, is right, and therefore all the rationalizations and justifications are right, and therefore the economics they put up are right, and so on and so forth. This is not honest, thinking. So, what's the problem that with the false alternative here? In the last several decades, we've had a lot of things change in the economy, but one of which is that, just using US data, we have increasingly marginalized an enormous number of people. It's 100 million people. The whole country is 350 million people. This does not include children and the elderly. So I don't know what the population of working age people is, but out of the population of working age people, let's call it 275 million as a wild guess, 100 million of them are not counted in the workforce, which means they're not working, but they're not unemployed because they have given up. And they're typically collecting disability or Social Security or on some welfare program or another, food stamps in many cases. So something terrible has happened. This is the absolute, this is the observation that should not be in dispute. Something horrible, something terrible has happened. And if you look at the data, this number has been rising for a very long time, but it takes a sharp upward turn after the crises in the late 1990s, long-term capital management and the monetary policy that was imposed after that, and then the crash of 2001. And then it takes another upward turn in 2008 and another upward turn in the response to COVID. And then after these things, there's a bit of a recovery, but it never goes back to its previous level and only gets worse. So the left is correct to say that something is happening that is forcing a widening rift between the poor and the rich. They're correct in the observation. And since we know where the left is going to go with this, their prescription is wrong. Prescription is capitalism caused this. And therefore, which is absolutely wrong, and therefore their prescription is evil. We need a wealth tax. We need an assets tax. We need this. We need, basically take all the money. This is what socialism always, always, always does. It seeks out capital to take it and consume it, or cause it to be consumed in some way. They love consuming capital. And when you're done consuming the capital, what do you do for an encore? Well, you're poorer. But while the capital lasts, it's like feasting on the seed corn, to use an analogy that Ayn Rand used. While you're eating the seed corn, it's party like there's no tomorrow. Party like it's 1999. When you run out, what was us? So that's the left. The right, eager to head them off at the pass, says there is no problem. We're richer than ever. Everything is fine. A lot of prominent objectivists will take this position. Capitalism, which they say we have, I have to go into my side rant. What do we have today? We have such a vast, expensive welfare state that even high and progressive income tax can't pay for it. That's, by the way, Communist Manifesto plank number 2, high and progressive income tax. Even that can't pay for it. So we've instituted a central bank, in order to finance. The central bank is plank number 5 from the Communist Manifesto. We have government regulation of every productive enterprise is subject to some government regulations. And by government regulations, mean if you don't do this, we can put you out of business. They force you to do things that you wouldn't do that are expensive. I'll get back to that a bit later. And if you don't do them, they have a way of destroying you. They can pull a license, they can deny permits, they can do all kinds of things. You're done. So you need their consent. And if you wonder why businesses are lapdogs to government and don't tend to fight back too much, it's because the government has their hand on the businesses. I'm not going to say the word, but I think everybody gets the gesture. So we have that. We have regulation of every productive enterprise. We have licensure of most professions. We have outright government ownership of what? Roads, rail, electric grid, water, sewer, radio spectrum, airports, harbors. It goes on and on and on. And schools, which is Communist Manifesto number 10. So we have at least 3 of the planks of the Communist Manifesto absolutely covered by the current system, which people call capitalism. And ironically, at the left and even the objectivists both agree. Now, the left calls it capitalism whenever something bad happens. The objectivists call it capitalism whenever there's a new iPhone or whenever Amazon cuts the cost of Sunday delivery. Meanwhile, we have this widening spread between poor and rich. The poor people are looking at the new iPhones coming out. They can't afford that shit. And so they are growing in resentment of this, and rightfully so, but at the wrong target. The left is saying the target should be the rich, the filthy corporations, big pharma, big banks, big whatever. What is the right saying? Enter the era of Trump. The right is saying the enemy is foreigners. This is America, damn it. And it's foreigners that have caused all this. We have exported all the language of the modern right is very collectivist, very central plannery, in that it's a collective we, who have exported or outsourced our jobs as if jobs are a property right vested in we, the people, or the government. And we have made a decision as a collective to put those jobs and give those jobs to the Chinese. And therefore, the Chinese and other countries have ripped off America. It's a rotten deal, terrible deal. And tariffs are going to reverse this and bring back employment, especially in manufacturing, such as we had in the 1950s, and everybody's going to have a job. Okay, well, we talked about the morality of this is bad. Now, to get more specific about it, the nominal complaint is it's not fair. It's not a level playing field. It's not fair trade. And they use the language of morality to say that America as a collective, as a we, can't export, and I'll take Canada now, can't export dairy to Canada because Canada tariffs American dairy exports or imports into Canada. And therefore, they shouldn't be able to export lumber, let's say, or maple syrup, or auto parts or automobiles without us, retaliating. Now, to put that in individualized terms, Canadian citizens are barred from, or it's at least made prohibitively expensive for them to buy dairy, produced by a farmer in the US. And therefore, American citizens who aren't anything to do with the dairy industry are now to be made prohibitively expensive to get Canadian lumber. So suppose I'm a building contractor, I'm a framing subcontractor, and I have a contract on a house to frame it, including the lumber package, for a certain amount of money. And now the US government is saying, well, we are getting back at them and we're making this fair, and imposes, could be 10%, could be 30%, whatever, tariff on Canadian imported lumber. And now we as a collective have gotten our collective revenge against Canada and everything's fine. Well, what am I as the individual building contractor supposed to do? I've got a contract. Contract has a price in it. I don't necessarily have the profit margins to absorb the tariff costs and still deliver the framed house, to my general contractor. So you always have one right under all these regulatory and tax regimes, and that right is to declare bankruptcy, wipe out the equity you've worked 30 years to build, destroy your hopes and dreams, show up either in the job line or the welfare line, lay off all your employees, default on your debts, and now impose a loss on the bank's balance sheets or whoever the creditors are. You always have that right. So I can go out of business and say, I can't honor my contract anymore. And that's going to happen. As an aside, people say, tariffs are bad because look at the stock market going down. And then when the stock market has an up day, as it's had one or two in the last week or so, then the pro-tariffs say, see, it wasn't that bad after all. The problem is, what's the stock market? What does that mean? It means either the 30 biggest crony corporations, which is the Dow, or the 500 biggest crony corporations, which is the S&P. That's what the stock market means to most people. Now, if we impose this kind of losses and these kinds of problems, is it going to affect the small companies, or is it going to affect the mega corporations worse? The small companies. So ironically and perversely, we can have something that's really bad economically causing the stock market to go up because it adversely impacts the competitors of these Fortune 500 companies, or S&P 500 companies, much more than it affects them. And even though the overall market for framing houses shrinks, the biggest corporation who does that gains relatively, compared to everybody else who's destroyed. And it also has a more resilient balance sheet. They still have access to credit to replace the sources and fix their supply chains and so on. So, this is looking in individual terms, the tariff is hurting American importers, American manufacturers, American consumers. So we talked about, in this case, manufacturers, somebody producing a framed house, but any manufacturer who uses whether it's imported Canadian stuff, imported European stuff, imported Chinese stuff, imported Mexican stuff, is impacted by all this. And even though, they say, okay, buy something that's made in America. There's nothing more made in America than a house that's built in America. By definition, it's made in America. But yet, if you tariff the materials that go into it, you could destroy the ability of the Americans who are producing it in America with American labor. You destroy their ability to even do it at all. Importing business obviously destroyed. Now, this comes to sort of a fundamental economic law, and just think about, why are there very few lions and why is there a very large number of zebras and wildebeest and all these other things? Because the predator population has to be tiny relative to the prey population. It's just math. It takes X amount of time for, a baby wildebeest to grow up into something that's going to feed a pride of lions, and the lions need to keep eating all during the monsoon season or whatever they call it, because then when the water goes away and the wildebeest move, the lions basically starve for part of the year, so they have to build up a lot of weight. It's the same thing in production. Let's say you take steel. So if we tariff imported steel, which is what Trump did in his first term, or imported aluminum, how many jobs are there in the U.S. steel industry? One would think thousands, maybe 10,000 or a few tens of thousands. How many jobs are there in all the downstream industries that use steel, whether it's car manufacturing, truck manufacturing, railroad manufacturing, aircraft manufacturing, appliance manufacturing, building material manufacturing? The list goes on, motorcycle manufacturing, the list goes on and on and on and on with industries that use that. So if there's 10,000 jobs in steel making that you think they're going to save with this tariff, there's maybe 1 million jobs impacted adversely by increasing the tariffs. Okay. This is just, the sort of the first order effect of all this, right? It's increase the price. You have this problem. So I want to get back to what's this false alternative is. The anti-capitalists say capitalism has caused the destruction of jobs, the destruction of, the suppression of jobs and of wages and of working people generally. The right is completely, and including many of the objectivists for that matter, are in complete denial. This is happening because, hey, we all have iPhones and iPhones are great. And we have life-saving drugs and we have all these things that if you are in a position where you are producing something whose value is scalable. So this applies to, engineers, software developers, finance people, product designers, these sorts of people. You're on top of the world, man. Life's great. These goods are getting cheaper and cheaper in relative terms, and everything's good. If you're working with your hands, doing a trade or something like that, you're looking up at those people over there and saying, there's no ladder anymore for me to climb to. I can't get there anymore. I'm living in, cheap digs. I can't afford any of that stuff. And, so that's where the resentment's built. The left, again, to a wealth tax, the right to tariff. What's the root of the problem? Nobody's asking what caused this. Well, the right doesn't even want to, the alleged free market right, including the objectivists, since they're not acknowledging the problem, don't feel any need to ask the question, what caused it? There isn't a problem. We don't agree there's a problem, therefore, case closed. Well, there is a problem, and that problem has principally two causes. And one is monetary, and I'll just simply say falling interest rates push down jobs and push down wages. One way to demonstrate this is that any discussion of manufacturing output in the United States, the US is manufacturing more than ever. Output is massive. Employment in manufacturing is way down. Well, what's the difference? It's automation. So a falling interest rate is an ever increasing incentive to replace labor with machines. So at any given level, there's a parity of I could buy a machine or I could hire 10 guys. If you lower the interest rate, you lower the debt service cost on the machine now becomes cheaper, and these 10 guys become marginalized. We've had 40 years of pushing down interest rates. That's 40 years of pushing down jobs. And in order to stay employed, these people either have to, every time the interest rate halves, these people either have to double their output or halve their wage in real terms, or some combination of the two. And 4 decades of this going back to 1981. This is a major, major part of the root of the problem. There's a lot more to be said about falling interest rates. I have tons of material that I've written about this, but accept that as a given for purpose of this conversation. The other factor that we have, I call them mandatory useless ingredients. And I developed this term as I was looking, I don't know what gasoline regulations look like, petrol regulations look like here in the UK. But in the United States, for part of the year, they're required to put in I think it's an oxidizer, I'm not quite sure, MBTE, methyl butatetraethylene, I think. If there's any organic chemists in the room and I get it wrong, send all emails to Dev Null. I don't want to hear it. No, just kidding. And the other part of the year, they have to put ethanol, I think. So these are expensive additives. They definitely add to the cost of a gallon or a liter. And what do they do for the consumer? They do nothing. Bugger all, as you'd say here in the UK. So this is a useless ingredient. It adds cost. It adds no value. And in most cases, the consumer is not even aware that this useless ingredient is there. They just think, oh, it's inflation. The purchasing power of my pound sterling, of my dollar is going down. To which I say, no, no, no. Your dollar is buying just as much as it used to. It's only now buying more and more things that you don't care about and don't even know about. Like it's paying whatever company manufactures MBTE in their supply chain, or it's paying the ethanol producers that ultimately are paying the farmers, which, adds all this cost. Everything that you can have, whether it's a computer, a video camera, a mug of beer, the mug itself, the beer itself, your car, the airline that carried me here from the United States, everything that you interact with or spend money on has mandatory useless ingredients in it. And those have been relentlessly rising year after year after year. They're always adding more. Compliance costs at every company in the world is only going up, and it's relentless. It's been doing so for a lot more than 40 years. Interest rates have been falling for 40 years. Useless ingredients have been going up since probably the entire 20th century, and certainly into the 21st century. Now, that cost of those useless ingredients has to come from somewhere. You either have to lay off people, or you have to force a smaller number of people to produce the same amount, or you have to automate, or something. Something's got to give, because if the government is doubling the cost of producing a thing, and the market isn't willing to pay double the cost, that's got to come out of somewhere. And labor is part of who's bearing the price of this. So we have these two forces that have been relentlessly for decade after decade after decade, pushing down jobs, pushing down wages, and falling interest rates does something wonderful if you are the top of the 1%, which is it pushes up asset prices. The prices of assets are basically the strict mathematical inverse of interest rates. It's a seesaw. You push down the interest rate, you push up asset prices. You push down the interest rate, you push up asset prices. So what does that do for the top 1%? Well, obviously, the asset owning class, especially, by the way, if they own it with leverage, they borrow money in order to buy that asset. Now you have a double benefit. The cost of the borrowing is going down, and the asset is going up even more. That's why you have people that are worth $300-400 billion now, like Elon Musk, right? As you're just pushing up the value of share prices and properties and a lot of other things. But there's also a whole lot of other people whose total compensation is tied to asset prices. And that's CEOs, bankers, brokers. There's a variety of professions that the more assets go up, the more money they make. And they probably benefit from owning assets themselves as well. Most CEOs own shares in the company that they're the CEO of. But just their total compensation, the CEO might get a salary of $700,000 and a bonus tied to how much the stock goes up, which could be worth 7 million or 70 million. So these groups are getting richer. These groups are being crushed. And we have a great deal of simmering resentment on both left and right. False alternative. Either the problem is capitalism or the problem is foreigners. Both wrong. Now, we get to the economics of trade deficit. We use the word deficit. Deficit sounds bad. Sounds like there's a shortfall of something, right? So imagine I want to sell some goods to my employer, and the supermarket, let's say it's Tesco, the company that sells the clothing I wear, let's say it's Harrods, the company that makes my car, let's say it's Jaguar. I have a deficit with all of those companies. Is that bad? Let's say I live in all the way out by Hounslow or something like that, but I do my shopping in central London. So Hounslow, on my behalf, has a deficit with London. Is that bad? Why does this only become bad when we cross an international border? This is nuts. Free trade, by definition, is beneficial to both of the individuals who are party to the trade. It's not Hounslow buying from London. It's me, if I live in Hounslow, buying from Harrods. And I deem that trade to be in my best interest, if it's uncoerced, assuming there's no law that assigns me this is where you will get your clothing rations fulfilled, assuming we're not a communist dictatorship. I find it to be in my benefit. I would rather have this than the money, and Harrods would rather have the money than one more, suit on the rack. And so it benefits both parties. And that's true whether we're talking about an individual with his deficit with his clothing supplier, whether it's a town with a deficit with another town, or whether it's a country with a deficit with another. The individuals have chosen to enter into this transaction. Both parties are winning. By definition, otherwise they wouldn't do it. If I thought it was a bad deal, if it was actually harming my interest, I wouldn't do that. So I don't have a deficit with the dealers of methamphetamines. I don't do methamphetamines, and therefore I have no deficit there. That's not in my interest. We don't need a law to stop me from doing that. We just need me to think and say, I don't want to do that. Okay, so what's really going on is individuals pursuing their self-interest. The problem is we have a monetary system which distorts everything. The United States dollar is the world's reserve currency. What does that mean? Most people think, oh, well, that's the one that's used in trade more than others. And then they look at the statistic, oh, the euro is rising as a percentage of world trade, therefore the dollar is losing its dominance. No. Reserve currency means it's the currency that's held as monetary reserves by all the central banks of the world, by all the major commercial banks of the world, and all the major corporations of the world. When they hold reserves, those are dollar reserves. Most people may not realize this. There's a gigantic derivatives market, which is approaching $1 quadrillion. That is 1,000 trillion. I mean, the amount of notional value of this is obscene, all of which is a product of the regime of irredeemable currency, which is what we live under. Anybody have any guess as to what percentage of all derivatives out there have the dollar in it? So there's the two major types of derivatives, or interest rate hedging derivatives and currency, FX pair hedging derivatives. What percentage of derivatives have the dollar on at least one side of the trade? Anybody have any guess in the audience, live audience here?
99.
Bingo. It's 99% have the dollar on at least one side of the trade. It is a dollar world. All the other paper currencies are not only dollar derivatives, they're the equivalent of a West Virginia 19th century coal mining town where the coal mining company has a paper scrip that it pays the employees, and then they can spend that scrip in the company store. All the other currencies, that's what they are. This is how the world is wired. I'm not saying this because I'm saying, yeah, America, we're great. I'm saying this is a screwed up system. It's very perverse, and there's a lot of ironies to it, and this is one of them. The grandest irony of all, this system was dictated to the world at the Treaty of Bretton Woods in 1944. Western Europe knew, the Allies knew, and the US knew the war was all over but the shouting. So they sat down and said, what is the new monetary order going to look like? Because in between, at the start of World War I, they destroyed the gold standard. After World War I, they sort of pretended to go back to gold, but not really. It wasn't the same after that. And then one by one, country after country pulled off the gold standard in the lead up to World War II. The United States in 1933 being one of the last, I believe. The US made it illegal for US citizens to own gold. It was a felony, as in go to prison to own gold. In 1944, we need a new currency regime. We need to figure this out. The world sat down, and the US dictated to everybody else because the US was the one standing there with all the munitions and the economy that was working, and nothing was really in rubble, like unlike the rest of the world, and said, this is what you're going to do, and you're going to like it. A little bit like Don Corleone. They made the world an offer that the world couldn't refuse. And the world said, thank you, Don Corleone. We'll take that. What people don't, most people, a lot of people know that if you study monetary stuff. What most people don't know is that the author of this insane system was none other than Harry Dexter White, who was later proven in criminal court to be a tool working for the Soviet Union. His aim was not to make America stronger. As much as the rest of the world calls the dollar, America's exorbitant privilege and resents the hell out of it, by zero-sum thinking, it's bad for us, therefore it must be good for you. Whereas we as objectivists know that sometimes there's such a thing as lose-lose. It's bad for us and it's bad for you, but it's bad for you in a different way. Right? It's kind of like the John sees the prostitute. It's pretty clear why that's probably not good for the prostitute. It's also not good for the John, but in a different way. So this system created something that an economist called Robert Triffin in 1960 talked about, and this is called Triffin's dilemma. The issuer of the world's reserve currency has now a choice between either domestic policy interests or the relentless need of the world for ever more credit in order to grow their economy. All irredeemable currencies require exponential growth of the quantity of currency units in circulation in order for the system to remain stable and let alone growing. And the issue of the world's reserve currency must do this, otherwise the whole globe collapses. This is the US's problem. And this is part of why there can be unlimited, exponentially growing trade deficits, that if we had a free market, and a free market in money means the gold standard. By the way, plug for a book that I contributed to. It's called Free Trade in the 21st Century, edited by Max Rangley and Daniel Hannan, published by Springer. And I contributed the chapter on the monetary policy for free trade in the 21st century, which is the gold standard. In a gold standard, you would never have exponential growth of trade deficits. There would be corrective factors that would kick in, and it becomes harder and harder and harder to sustain a deficit as it gets worse and worse and worse. Everything in the free market was characterized by negative feedback loops. The more you do of it, the more resistance there is. But when the government takes things over, they sometimes replace negative feedback loops with positive feedback loops, and things run away. Think Jimi Hendrix, he plays that note and he takes the guitar and he puts it towards the amplifier. And the speaker in the amplifier is vibrating, which makes the air vibrate, which hits the strings and makes them vibrate, which then goes into the amplifier and makes it louder. And you get this positive feedback and it squeals. This is a positive feedback loop. If there weren't circuitry in the amplifier designed to detect this and limit it, this would grow louder and louder and louder, and the circuit gets hotter and hotter and hotter until the house would catch on fire. Positive feedback loops do not end well. They end very, very badly. Anyway, they have circuits to detect that. That will not happen. It just gets loud to a certain point, and then it clips. We have positive feedback loops that enable, infinitely growing, trade deficits. This is another thing not taken into account by the false alternative of, hey, it's foreigners versus it's capitalism. No one's really talking about Triffin's dilemma. That's something, if you say it, even in economic circles, people have to Google it to even remember what the hell that was. Well, it's still in full force and effect, today. So we have this problem, and we think, okay, tariffs are going to fix it. Well, let's drill into that. First of all, we've made it, just using America now, between the regulation, the interest rate problems, and sort of general government intrusiveness, labor law being another, minimum wage, and then welfare effectively sets the minimum wage. If somebody can get paid the equivalent of $25 an hour or whatever it is nowadays to collect food stamps and sit in public subsidized housing, have their health care provided for and everything else they could want or need, probably including an iPhone, and get the equivalent of $25 an hour, well, how much as a private business do you have to offer to incentivize somebody to get their ass off welfare and come and work for you? More than 25. So we have several ways of effectively setting the floor under wages, which is very, very high, and it destroys certain kinds of businesses. Now, there's two concepts from Austrian economics that I think are so important that everybody in the world should get them, maybe not in grammar school, but let's say in high school. The first is margin or marginal. Right. So Trump said the other day, or tweeted, or Truth Social, or wherever this went, the strong, only the weak fail. So there's this obsession with strong as in a tightly bundled pile of sticks. That was Mussolini's analogy. Hitler was also very obsessed with strong. He's strong. He went to the Aryan youth to be strong. Only the strong will survive, the weak will fail. Well, economists would say it's at the margin that companies fail. So if you increase costs by one tick, the marginal business is the one who can't make any money anymore, defaults on their credit, lays off their employees, and ruins the owner. Every time you do something, whether it's increase the tax, increase the tariff, increase the regulation, it's the business at the margin and the workers at the margin who are rendered unemployable and bankrupt. So that's what tariffs do. Even if somehow you thought you want to balance the trade deficit, what you're going to do is you're going to destroy American businesses at the margin. And the more you raise tariffs, the wider that margin gets. We're talking the margin will be destroyed if you raise the tariff by 1 basis point, one 100th of 1%. You raise tariffs by 35%. That's a very fat margin. That suddenly everything under that margin is destroyed. It would be like putting the minimum wage here in the UK at £100 an hour. How many people would lose their jobs? Almost everybody. Almost nobody is. Very few people are producing sufficiently high value that they're worth, that wage. Everyone else who produces less would be rendered unemployable. The second concept from Austrian economics is the concept of ordinal and how individual valuers value things. They kind of stack rank it in order. So let's say you're a business and you're manufacturing something. Why are you in China? Well, China is your first choice. China is the best choice because the ratio of cost and benefit, or cost and quality, is better there than it is in America. That's by definition. That's why you chose China. And the fact that so many companies did, something has said that China's better. Now, part of it is regulatory arbitrage. There's a lot less of this sort of crappy regulation and useless ingredients in China than there is in the United States. Therefore, it makes sense to offshore. Unless you want to repeal all of that stuff, including the welfare state, that gives people a $25 an hour check for doing nothing, things go to China. Now, when companies say, okay, fine, Mr. Trump, Don Corleone, we're going to close our Chinese factory, open up in the US, everybody on the national conservative right that I can see in my feed, it must be universal, are saying, see, we said this was going to work. I love the term work. Win. It's so much winning, and we're winning. I like to make an analogy. Suppose you work in a white-collar job in an air-conditioned office, and you have a comfy chair, and you sit at a screen, and you think for a living, and you get paid decently well for it. And it's air-conditioned in the summer when it's hot, and it's heated in the winter. And the government made your job or your employer illegal. So the whole thing shut down, and you were forced to take a job in a factory, which is hot and dirty and gritty and noisy and full of vibration and hazards, and stand on your feet all day, and it's physical and you're moving around and it hurts your back. And oh, by the way, you're getting paid a fraction to stamp out toaster casings versus what you used to get paid in the office. Would anybody dare call that a win for anybody? Of course not. But when companies are forced to go from choice number one, well, that's been rendered illegal or at least uneconomic, and they're forced to go to choice number two, we should never declare that a win. By definition, we're making them choose something that was worse than what they had wanted to choose in the first place. By the way, what's the objectivist concept of force? It attacks the mind. Your mind is concluding, I want to manufacture over there. But there's a man with a gun who says, I will not let you even think about manufacturing over there. You're going to manufacture over here, buddy, if you know what's good for you. As he takes off the safety, he pops the trigger. He's attacked your mind. Well, now you're not allowed to think that, or certainly not allowed to act on that conclusion. You just have to say, yes, sir, yes, sir. That's it. That's not a win. That's a horrible loss. That is evil. But also, just economically, we forced the company to go from producing more with less and switch over to producing less with more. the whole notion of we got to create jobs is a fallacious notion. What we want companies to do is not create jobs, but to create goods. It's the goods we want. Of course, employment is a consequence of that. You can't produce something without hiring anybody, but it's the goods we want. We don't want to maximize how much labor it is. Milton Friedman, who was a very mixed bag, in my opinion, was saying to the Chinese one time, well, if it's jobs you want, why are you giving them shovels? Why don't you give them spoons to dig those holes? And you use a lot more labor to dig the same hole. So that's what tariffs are doing at an economic level. Tie all this together, and what do you have? Well, you have the wrong understanding of the problem, and you have a wrongful solution that's actually harming. Oh, so one other thing I want to address on that. Who's actually paying the tax? This is controversial, believe it or not. I mean, the law is pretty clear. There's no jurisdiction. Trump doesn't send an army over to China to invade Beijing, open up the bank vaults where they have a warehouse full of dollars, offload those onto some naval ship and sail back to the US. If you import goods from China, which basically means you're an American company, you must pay this or else we throw you in prison. We're charging it to Americans. And then what is that importer or distributor going to do? Well, unless he wants to lose huge amounts of money on every unit, he has to increase his price to the manufacturer or whoever the buyer is who's buying this stuff. And that's who's paying it. Now, the argument is, well, the Chinese will effectively have to lower their price so that net of tariffs, it's the same. Maybe that's true. I don't think the factories that stamp out, cheap widgets have these kinds of profit margins. Rousey was telling me before the thing, he said, do you know what the tariffs are right now? I said, well, I kind of feel like this is like the gold price or the US budget debt, US government debt. Like, unless I've looked in the last 5 minutes, no, I don't know the answer because it keeps changing so fast. So you said, Rousey, it was 104%?
Raised it to 125 on China and froze it at 10%.
125 on China. Do the factories that are stamping out the widgets in China have profit margins so big that you can slap 125% tariff on it and they can still make money? Of course not. So one of two things are going to happen. They either have to pass that on, or it's one of three things. They can either pass it on, they can shut down, or they can eat the loss and continue to do the business at least for a while. Now, earlier I said socialists love the idea of consuming capital. They're obsessed with it. They're driven by it. They think of it morning, noon, and night, and they dream of it when they're asleep. How can we find capital, seek it out to consume? We now have the right saying it's going to be the manufacturing companies or the manufacturing country who's going to eat the loss of the tariff. That is exactly that idea. They have an instinct, like a cunning fox, and smell it. There's capital over there that we can consume it by passing this ridiculous tariff law. We can force them to consume their capital, and they can eat that loss, at least for some period of time. And then, of course, the parasite, the socialist is parasite. When there's a tick on your skin or a leech, it never really thinks about the future. It's just sucking the blood. And if there's enough of them, or if it does it for long enough, it will kill the host. The parasite never thinks about the host. And the socialists never think, this is Atlas Shrugged, right? And Hank Rearden says, how am I supposed to function under this new tax or regulation or whatever? Well, we don't know, but you'll find a way, Mr. Rearden. You always do. How are these Chinese factories supposed to eat this loss? We don't know, Mr. Ching, but you'll find a way. You always do. They're socialists, and they want to parasitically attach to that. It's probably not going to work that way for the most part. The price is going to go up because there isn't an alternative. Why isn't there an alternative? Because there isn't an army of 150 million Americans willing to turn screws and stamp out cases for toasters and weld the panels on the side of the toaster for the kind of wages that the Chinese are doing it. There really isn't that kind of workforce here in the UK or in the US. And so what we're going to end up with is much higher input prices. And now what does that do to the US manufacturers that are buying these tariff things as ingredients into their goods? Well, they face the same bitter pill. It's either try to raise prices or try to eat it somehow, or maybe find some efficiencies, lay off some more people, buy some more automation. Oh, by the way, the automation equipment is also being tariffed. If it comes from China, it's 105%. If it's coming from Germany, it's 10%. Right? So we've made it more difficult to automate your way out of this. But eventually, here's the problem. The manufacturers can't charge more, whether it's a toaster or a car. The market's not willing to pay more, at least not for the volumes that are currently being demanded by the market. You can't just raise your price. If you raise your price, you lose the volume. And therefore, you probably lose more money by not producing anything, not selling anything, versus losing a little bit per unit. So they lose a little bit per unit for a while until somebody cries uncle, declares bankruptcy, and goes out of business. That's when prices can go up, because when somebody goes out of business, supply goes down. With supply going down, if demand were the same, prices go up. That will obviously reduce demand to meet the new supply. This is very standard classic economics. Prices can't go up just because costs went. That's not how it works. Go buy a brand new Beamer and tell your boss, my costs went up, therefore my salary has to go up. It doesn't work that way. Prices go up when supply goes down. And this is how we're going to cause supply to go down. We're going to cause producers to go out of business. So we think we're saving producers, right? So perversely, we have this exactly backwards. We think we're saving American producers, and we're going to destroy them in sufficient mass quantities such that supply goes down, and finally price can go up to cover the costs. Depending on how much the costs go up, that determines how much supply we have to destroy. The net result will be the morally impractical. We're initiating the use of physical force against innocent people to do what? To make them poorer. The net result will be everybody who lives in a tariff regime is impoverished. And the degree of impoverishment is the degree of the tariff, i.e. the percentage rate. Not linear, and there's some discontinuities there as well, but the higher the tariff, conceptually, the greater the impoverishment. We are headed towards a great deal of impoverishment unless there's a backlash where people say, stop this tariff nonsense before this gets, really ugly. I didn't even address international relations. The US used to be a friendly country as perceived by a lot of the world. I think it's going to be perceived much more adversely going forward. The consequences of that will be very long range and very adverse. I don't know where all this is going. Geopolitically, that's not my specialty. But from an economic standpoint, this is all pretty black and white. There's really not a lot of room for opinions or controversies here. If you understand it, it is what it is. And with that, I think I'll conclude my remarks and open for questions.
All right, so we have a lot of time for questions. We'll take questions from the live audience and from the YouTube audience. If you're watching on YouTube, of course, super chats will be prioritized. But if you have a question that's not a super chat, we might ask it as well. Thank you, Bronx Guy, Gun Hill Road, for the super chat. Bronx Guy says, excellent, knowledgeable, poignant guest. And thank you, Bonnie, for the super chat. Bonnie says, Keith is the best, knowledgeable in economics and philosophy. Thanks, both. Any questions from the audience? Oh.
The question I've got, it touches on the monetary side of this. In many of the discussions that I've heard over the last week or so about the Trump tariff measures, is very little's been said in the way that you've described it as to where the issue of the dollar as a reserve currency fits into this, and to things such as the enormous imbalance between very low levels of savings on average in the US, say, and those in places of Asia. Why have those who, including those who've said pretty sensible things about tariffs, been so neglectful of the monetary part of the jigsaw puzzle? It seems to me that this is a really big missing part of the discussion. What do you think's going on here?
Without knowing who specifically said what or didn't say what, I couldn't comment too specifically. I do believe in general that monetary economics today is where physics was before Galileo, which is myth, superstition, and ivory tower, people philosophizing. So before Galileo, my understanding is they thought if you throw a rock, it will fly straight until it runs out of force and then drop. And of course, if you go into a farm field and find a boy and say, boy, throw a rock, you'll see it doesn't do that at all. It does this. In fact, there's an entire sport and at the time method of war called archery to describe the shape of that. And so they just weren't making observations. They were superstitious. That's where I think monetary economics is today. I think most people think the value of a currency is 1 over n, where n is the number of units. You double the quantity, you double the price level. They also think that the value of a currency is 1 over p, where p is the general price level, and therefore p is proportional to n. And that's pretty much it. You don't need to say anything more about it. And so if prices aren't skyrocketing, then it must be, you see, what had happened was, and they have all these fancy hand wavy things, they created all this money supply, but it stayed in the banking system and it didn't circulate, and blah, 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 you know, they get faster and faster. And so therefore it's not a factor, and the actual real money supply didn't, or whatever it is, but they don't really see the monetary system as an iterative, interactive component that's interacting in astonishing or counterintuitive ways with, you know, producers and so on. So they say, well, if you increase the quantity of money, price level should go up. And I say, there's times when if you increase the quantity of dollars, which by the way are in money, they're credit, then the interest rate goes up, which was 1947 to 1981, that was true. But there's other times when more issuance of currency causes the interest rate to fall. Producers are responding to interest rates massively. Right, so suppose you're a hamburger restaurant chain and you have 57 stores. You always have a spreadsheet in your back pocket for the 58th store that you would like to open, but it's submarginal. So the very bottom of the spreadsheet, cell number A711 is red. It's a negative number. Then they cut the interest rate. Interest is one of your biggest expenses. Cut the interest rate, ding, it flips over from red to black. You build a store. Does that increase or decrease the price of hamburgers? Well, obviously you're adding more hamburger capacity. And the manufacturers of hamburger grilling equipment are also finding the same thing. Ding, they put in another production line. And the manufacturers of those ceramic tiles they have on the floor of every McDonald's, and the manufacturers of plate glass windows and all the other things, interest rate goes down. It's an increasing subsidy to produce more. I don't think this is, not only is I don't think it's widely understood, if I said this even in monetary economic circles, this is highly controversial. It's not well understood, not accepted, let alone understood. And so given the limitations of their theory, and by theory I call it pre-Galilean physics notions theory, in air quotes, because it's not really much of a theory, doesn't really explain anything. Given the limitations of their mental view of all this, what are they going to say about the monetary side? Well, prices went up, but then they compare wages to prices. One of my first Forbes articles I wrote in 2012 was looking at wages are falling in real terms, and how do you measure this, and how do you understand this? And so I looked at, there was some great data from the Wisconsin Dairy Association. Between 1967 and 2012, the real resources that went into producing a gallon of milk fell by about 90%. So that's the amount of land per cow, the amount of milk per cow, the amount of labor per cow, everything moved so that we reduced resources massively. So if we had some sort of objective unit of measure of economic value, gold, right, you should see the price of milk falling 90% if it weren't for useless ingredients that are rising anyway. And yet the only thing that people care about is the wage relative to the price of the milk. So I make an analogy. Imagine you had a couple of GoPro cameras and you're standing at the top of the cliff, and you strap one GoPro camera onto a brick, another GoPro camera onto a piece of plywood, and you chuck both over the edge of the cliff. Well, the plywood is going to fall slower because it has more wind resistance, right? So the GoPro camera on the brick is going to see the plywood going up. And so the brick is, you know, the consumer prices, the plywood is wages. So wages are falling. The dollar is falling, wages are falling, prices are falling, and because you're using a falling unit of measure to try to measure things, everything's distorted, and you're like, well, in inflation-adjusted terms, wages went up 1% or something like that since whatever year. You missed the point. Wages are going down massively. In fact, in 2012, the wage of a senior engineer was lower than the wage of unskilled labor in 1967 when measured in gold. When measured in dollars, of course, massively higher. So everything's all distorted, but they live in the distortion field and they can't really see. It's like the fish doesn't see the water. So the fish doesn't really have a theory of how water affects everything. If you ask, sort of like you're to rewrite your question in this funny analogy, why don't the fish have a theory of why occasionally humans seem to drown? They can't grasp the concept of drowning because they're fish.
Thank you, Matt, for the super chat. Matt asks, let's hear your US stock market predictions. Thanks.
So if I had, I mean, there's so much volatility and so much uncertainty, and a lot of that uncertainty is what the politicians will do next. I have no special insight as to what our politicians are going to do next, any more than anybody else does. Right? So there's certain things as a matter of economic law, I can say work a certain way, but what the politicians will do, I don't know. However, assuming we're on the course we're on, and there isn't any further radical change, which is, by the way, a gigantic assumption, probably not going to prove out to be true. But assuming that, what I would predict is massive amounts of economic destruction, Americans becoming more and more impoverished, fewer and fewer medium and small size firms, and therefore less and less competition for the 500 biggest crony corporations. So for that reason, I think I would expect with reduced competition, increased market share, if not increased volume by the 500 biggest cronies, I'd expect the share prices to go up. And I'll add one more factor. Remember what I said earlier about interest rate and asset prices being a seesaw? I expect this time around, when the crisis begins to hit in earnest, the Fed will be much more hyper proactive than it was in 2007 and 2008. Today's Fed thinks that the 2007 Fed was asleep at the switch and that they were negligent. And this time around, they'll be much faster. And so add the relative gain of the big cronies versus the smaller firms. On top of that, add falling interest rates, because I think the Fed's going to slam them back to zero in a New York minute when the crisis begins. Remember what I said, all these bankruptcies cause holes in the bank's balance sheets. That's what's going to cause the credit crisis, which causes everything else, recession is downstream of that. The Fed's going to respond very aggressively, push this interest rate to zero, asset prices go up. I would think at the end of the day, we'll have a higher stock market. And that doesn't mean anything good, but for people that are speculating on stock prices, bully for them. This is not investment advice, and there's a lot that can go wrong with this, including Trump could say something tomorrow that wasn't on anybody's bingo card today. For instance, like we're going to invade Greenland and Canada and Panama. That wasn't on my, and I had bad expectations for what Trump would do, but at the end of 2024, that was not on my 2025 bingo card. So those sorts of things, all bets are off when, geopolitical deuce is wild. All bets are off.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. You said something about China being a better manufacturer regarding regulations or something like that compared to the United States. I mean, to me, this is surprising because this is the Communist Party, and you're saying that they're better than, to me, I couldn't. Could you give me a bit more of a context of how?
So the question is, how can I say China is better in any regard versus the United States? China's a communist country. A few things. I would say they call it the Chinese Communist Party, and it's one thing, it's been a contiguous institution going back to Mao. However, it's not really communist today, probably more like fascist. There's certain things you cannot do in China. If you say President Xi is whatever, anything bad, they can disappear you to a secret prison in the middle of the night and torture you. If you do anything they deem to be unpatriotic, you're doing too much of business abroad, the wrong kind of business, billionaires even. Was it Jack Ma? I think it was Jack Ma of Alibaba, disappeared for like a year, 8 months, something, a long time. We don't know what was done to him. But after that, he has been seen in public. However, he's no longer outspoken. And, we don't know. But Jack Ma knows. So in that sense, no, it's absolutely authoritarian. However, from everything I've read, and I'm not an expert on it, and I don't read Chinese, so I can't read the Chinese laws. But from, I have American, friends who are expats there, including an objectivist. I don't want to say names, but some people in the audience would know who it is. talk about, it's a lot easier to get a minimal license and open up a food service business or a little manufacturing business or whatever. In America, regulatory compliance has become more and more and more aggressive. And it hits you in more and more and more ways that are counterintuitive and create all kinds of liability in companies of any size. I mean, startups may ignore this for the most part, but companies of any size have very sizable compliance departments. I mean, if I talk about a gold refinery, you think, what is a gold refinery? Well, they dissolve the gold in acid, and then they, filter out whatever, and then they add something to precipitate just the gold, and they, capture that, and then they melt it, whatever. So it's basically a wet shop and a hot shop, is what you would think. No. It's a compliance shop with a wet shop and a hot shop attached on the back. It's all about compliance. So I think you have a lot less of that in China. And obviously much lower wages as well. And so it ends up being, especially if you want to produce, you want to manufacture, America, and it's not just the federal government, it's the state government, the county government, the town government, the local municipality. You say you want to build a factory, all the local neighbors show up at the town zoning, permitting process to argue why they put your factory there, and we don't need this, and all kinds of collectivist arguments. Take years to get through the permitting process. That doesn't happen in China, is my understanding.
There's an advisor to Trump who, and I think an economic advisor, who seems like he was very influential, and his name is Robert Lighthizer, and I think he served under Reagan, and he's in the first Trump term, and Trump seems to get most of his opinions about tariffs from this guy. So this guy's an economist, and he denies completely that there could be any negative effects of tariffs. He had that line, and but he talks a lot about how China is an adversary, and how it's dangerous for the US for security reasons to rely on China in any way, especially for military equipment. So that seems like a rational fear. And his solution to that is tariffs. And then he goes further to say that tariffs will create jobs, will make America great,
Right.
and you should have tariffs with every country because deficits are bad. So he has all that aspect which is bad. I really agree with you. Just the aspect of dealing with China and adversarial countries. What's your opinion about how to deal with it?
So the question was, just so the audience can hear it, there's an economist who works for Trump, who goes way back and worked for Reagan as well, apparently, who says tariffs won't cause any. What?
The audience can hear you saying that.
Oh, he's able to hear him?
Yeah.
So I don't need to repeat this. Okay. This economist said, tariffs aren't going to do anything bad, which is just so disingenuous. A friend of mine, Phil Magnus, who's a free market economist guy, written a lot about the COVID lockdowns, said there were very, very few, the idea that tariffs are bad is almost universally accepted by economists. Very, very few economists argue that tariffs could be good in any way. Unfortunately, all three of them work for Trump. I thought, oh, that's good. You win the internet today, Phil, if you're watching this. That's good. If the problem is China's a military threat, you don't tariff Canadian lumber, you don't talk about trade deficits and job protectionisms, you don't tariff Scotch whiskey, French wine, Greek olive oil, you don't tariff any of the stuff. You say, this is what we're going to do to adjust China. First of all, you tell China what you want them to do or not do. You tell them what the consequences are going to be. And then that wouldn't be a tariff. That would just be a ban on, I presume, a ban on anything, any trade with China, and you put them on the enemies list like Iran and North Korea. I mean, I'm not saying we should do this, but if that were the premise, then that's what one would do, right? Running around tariffing everything, declaring that tariff is the best word in the dictionary. Call me tariff man. I mean, the problem with all the stuff from Trump, and tariffs are just a great example of it. It's an endless series of pivots. First we say this, and then when somebody attacks that argument, we just pivot to this. And when somebody attacks that argument, we pivot to this. When somebody attacks that argument, then this is already forgotten. Now we can pivot back and go back to the original. And so the idea that we're going to fix the China problem with tariffs is just one in a string of pivots that I don't think is, I think it's disingenuous. Anyways.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Do you wanna come maybe closer to the
Yeah.
microphone, to the microphone, right, back there?
Well, I had a question which was very, very similar to yours. So I suppose I'll give that one quickly. But yeah, if I think it's fundamentally different when the deficit, so to speak, that I have with Tesco on chicken and cloths, right, is fundamentally different to the production dependence Western nations have when it comes to shipbuilding compared to China, or drone production, which is vital industries for war. And for these strategic industries, do you think perhaps targeted tariffs on those industries serve a purpose? That was my original question, but I know you've half answered that. So my second question would be, do you think Bitcoin or crypto more generally could, in the modern era, serve a similar function to gold going forwards? So two questions there.
So if the first question is about supply chain dependency on a potentially hostile foreign power, again, I think there's a pretty simple answer to that, which is for anything defense related, the government can say no Chinese content, which my understanding is they do, and they've been saying that for decades. I don't think the US DoD and its contractors are buying anything critical from China. I could be wrong on that, and things can change, but that would be pretty simple to say, okay, anything procured by DoD, no Chinese content, and prove it. Prove your supply chain. That's why we're paying very, very richly for what we procure. Prove it. As to civilian industries, there's very much a it's in the spirit of Thomas Malthus, an Malthusian idea that he didn't say this directly, but I think it's in his spirit, that the more global the economy becomes, the more interconnected the supply chain becomes, therefore the more fragile human existence is. And therefore we should force everybody to go back to an idyllic medieval time when your supply chain didn't extend beyond 1 kilometer. And therefore accept the poverty, the grinding, awful, horrible poverty when half your kids would be expected to die before they hit adulthood and so on, and life expectancy was 37 years old. And if there was a bug that ate your potato plants, half the population would starve to death. Or if there was a disease like cholera, or whatever Black Plague was, half or 2/3 of the population would perish, because in that kind of grinding poverty, all hands are needed to produce food, and they can barely keep up with everybody's hunger. There's no opportunity to have hospitals, research hospitals, and researchers and doctors and chemistry labs and all that. Everyone's just producing food. So let's shrink ourselves back to that out of fear that somehow a globally interconnected supply chain could make us vulnerable. When I think the right answer is to say, sure, if you destroy the global supply chain, that's going to disrupt everything. Therefore, let's have the rule of law, and let's have not the United Nations, but a proper, forum for producing, free or semi-free countries to work out their differences peacefully, so that we can have global supply chains and life can be better, rather than, well, that creates a vulnerability and therefore let's restrict ourselves. It's kind of like we're going to run out of oil one day, and therefore let's impose laws that prevent us from using oil. I.e., let's pretend as if we already had run out. Let's pretend as if all of our global supply chains had been destroyed and bring ourselves back to the Dark Ages. Well, I'm not in favor of that.
There's a second part of the question.
Oh,
Can crypto replace gold? No. I think I've given a couple of talks here talking about crypto versus gold. The volatility precludes. So there's an old saying: money has functions for. What is it? A medium, a measure, a unit, a store. And when something is that volatile, I think it just obliterates all four of those. It's not suitable for savers, especially older people. It's not suitable for borrowers. Why would you borrow something that's the proponents are telling you it's going to go up 1,000-fold. So that means your mortgage, right? So you buy a flat here and you have a mortgage of whatever, 4,000 quid a month. And they're promising it's going to go up to 4 million quid a month. I mean, nobody could borrow it, which means nobody can save and get interest in it. Monetary metals, we pay interest on gold, and gold does work this way. Crypto does not. And I have my old nemesis. I debated Pierre Rochard, gold versus Bitcoin, at the Soho Forum, which was recorded on video. And anybody watching this who's curious can Google Keith Leonard versus Pierre Rochard, Soho Forum, gold versus Bitcoin, and watch the debate. And I talked about this. So that particular guy is now involved in a startup who's doing some sort of crypto-related yield, crypto-related bond. So I asked him, what thing is being lent? And then he gave me a fairly straight answer. Dollars are being lent, crypto is the collateral. So crypto is acting like money in the same way that real estate acts like money, i.e. it doesn't act like money whatsoever. It's a collateral for the transfer of money or currency. So no, it doesn't work.
Either speak very loudly or come next to the microphone.
So there was a guy that you were talking about, Harry Dexter White, and so you gave him like an idea, like he was the guy behind the curtain sort of idea. Could you give me a bit more context?
He was the architect of the Bretton Woods Monetary Treaty. So America told the rest of the world how it's going to work. He was America's architect. He was an apparatchik in the Roosevelt administration that told the world, basically designed the monetary system on behalf of America. The American delegation told the world, this is what you will like.
Can I give one more question?
Go ahead.
All right, so it's regarding the low interest rates and the automation questions. So regarding the 10 guys, the automation, I think that. So I'm just going to add on more to it. I think it has something to do with the minimum wage laws. So like, sure, so between automation of the 10 guys, but because of minimum wage laws, you can't actually hire the 10 guys, which is why it might be cheaper to go like the automation. But I didn't hear minimum wage laws. I heard the low interest rates, and which makes it cheaper to go for automation if you get what I mean.
Well, there's a number of factors. And so I did at one point talk about minimum wage and the effect of minimum wage because of the generous welfare state, right? But the broader context here is, why are wages being pushed down? Right, so in the 1950s, people who worked in that factory stamping out panels for toasters were not paid anywhere near what we call minimum wage today. They were paid far higher than that. So, if, they were way above minimum wage. A factory worker in the 1950s was able to, with a single income, feed a family of 4, buy a house, buy a car, have a vacation once a year, and so on. It was nowhere near minimum wage. If you set a minimum wage, it wouldn't have affected him. Why is that type of work today such low value that what economic forces have happened to render that impossible today, where that factory worker would be paid minimum wage, if minimum wage were even lower than it currently is? So even more of a poverty wage. A minimum wage would be, if you're earning that, you're not feeding a family of 4, let alone buying a house. What happened to make that the case today?
Well,
And it's not minimum wage laws. I can't answer that question. It's useless ingredients. It's falling interest rates.
I was thinking of social welfare might be this the case also, because there was
Part of it. Part of it.
That's it.
Keith, can I ask the question, the point you made it earlier on about the US dollar's status as a reserve currency, which is often trotted out as a sort of explanation as to why the US has been able to run vast debts for very long periods of time. And you made an interesting observation that it's a blessing and a curse. The curse is that in order to retain the status of reserve currency, you have to keep producing more of this stuff. You have to keep printing more and more money. It's like a sort of a carousel that you can't get off. I've never heard it explained in quite that way before. How did you come to that realization? Because in a way, as you all know, with carousels that you can't get off, eventually something very bad happens. I mean, does that insight itself give you some idea as to when or if the reserve currency status of the dollar comes to an end?
So I think, so how I came up with the insight, well, there's a lot of more sort of core observations that kind of lead to that. But, my dissertation, I talk about some indicate the harbingers of the collapse of the system. And by the way, I don't think end of the dollar as reserve currency means some other paper currency will take over. The other paper currencies, number one, are dollar derivatives. So that's like call options on Apple can't take over if Apple collapses to zero. The call options would also be worth zero, probably go to zero before Apple did. And secondly, none of them have anywhere near the magnitude, the liquidity, the flows. There's so many properties that make the dollar what it is. None of the other currencies come remotely close to, to being able to suffice. What I think happens, our system is increasingly incentivizing capital consumption. So for anybody interested in this, I gave a keynote lecture at AIER some years ago, pre-COVID, American Institute for Economic Research. And the talk was yield purchasing power. And I compared the idea of purchasing power, the idea that, let's say I inherit a farm from my grandfather, and I look at the purchasing power of the farm, I think, well, real estate's pretty valuable nowadays. I'll sell the back 40 to a condominium developer. And I'll chop down the orchard of fruit trees because it's really hip to make cabinets out of fruit wood. And I'll even tear down the barn because everybody wants floors made of barn planks. I'll rip apart my tractor and sell it to an artist to make some sort of objet d'art to put in the atrium of this condominium complex. And every time I sell one of these things, I can buy groceries for a few years. So I'm consuming my capital. And while it lasts, it's great fun. And since asset prices keep going up, boy, that's a lot of great fun. But at the end of the day, I'm ruined. I have nothing left. I've sold off the last bit of capital. There was a scene in Atlas Shrugged when Jim Taggart sold off some sort of asset, and Dagny complains, what? You said I should make a profit. And he's confusing selling off, liquidating your assets with a profit, which it's not. So what I think our monetary system is doing is creating the perverse incentive to consume capital. And capital is both precious, but more importantly, it's finite. And it takes a lot of capital to support an industrial scale civilization. We have to produce two things at industrial scale, at an absolute minimum, to survive as civilization. One is energy and the other is food. And of course, food production and food distribution depend on energy at industrial scale. If either or both of those, the capital supporting either or both of those collapses, it can no longer support that. Then our civilization collapses, the population will starve and collapse. And lots of really, really bad things happen. Cue your favorite Mad Max movie or The Day After, or any of these types of movies. Hammer of the Gods, which is an asteroid hitting, but you have those kind of scenarios, and it'll be a dark age. I think the collapse will be infinitely worse than 476 AD. And in 476 AD, the population of Rome fell by more than 90%, by the way. Some of those people maybe found a villa somewhere in the south of what we call France today. Most of them would have perished either in Rome or on the road of either, bandits or disease or starvation or exposure or whatever. And I think today it'll be a lot worse because much smaller percentage of the population have anything to do with the land or agriculture. Today, very, very few people are employed in food production. They use massive machines and chemicals and engineered seeds and all these things that are all going to go away in this kind of scenario. Who's going to produce food and how much of it can they produce? That becomes a very severe problem very quickly. Now, in London, it's hard to imagine water being, lack of water killing people because you have plenty of water and it falls out of the sky here. I live in Phoenix. Phoenix doesn't get 12 centimeters of rain a year. If the electricity turns off for any reason, Phoenix will be a killing zone within days, let alone in the summer when the temperatures can hit 50 centigrade and very, very dry. You need a lot of water to stay alive. So horrific things happening At the end of that, gold will reemerge as it did after, Rome was debasing its currency in the final years of its survival as well. Gold will reemerge in the end, but slowly and only haltingly, because to have gold, you're inviting somebody to kill you. And in that kind of world, you don't want to do that. So when Rome fell, it was about 1500 years before the world had recovered to Roman levels of technology. Think about concrete, think about engineered plumbing systems and things like that. It was really 19th century when the world had recovered what Rome had, 1500 years later. So this is something we want to avoid. This is not something they say, bring it, great reset, man. No, this is something we should avoid. Assuming we love life. If you really want to die and you want to see everyone else die, then I guess you should be cheering for the great reset.
Yeah, also, if you love life, that spoiler is not an excuse not to read Atlas Shrugged if you haven't read it yet.
Spoiler.
Thank you, David, for the super chat. David asks, what potential political or economic situation could occur that would reduce gold's desirability as a store of value?
I don't think there's an answer to that question. I mean, the United States government made it illegal. It was a felony. Like today, if you get caught with a funny white powder, they're throwing you in prison. That's what they did to people that own gold. They didn't make gold less valuable. They just made gold go underground. So there was a term that was coined at that time, 1933, midnight gardening. That you have this gold, you don't want to be caught with the gold. So you dig a little hole in your yard, about a meter deep or however deep you could get, I suppose, with a hand shovel at midnight. And you put the gold to the bottom, you put some soil back in, you put a flower on top of it, so it's not suspicious. Why is there, some fresh dirt in the middle of your grass? And that was midnight gardening. So some people did turn in their gold because they trusted the government or they were afraid of it or whatever, but most people did not. And gold did not become less valuable. When they re-legalized gold, so after 1971, Nixon severed the final link between the dollar and gold, which was a tenuous, link that wasn't not really much of a gold standard by 1971 anyway. Severed that link, but he said temporarily. So nobody really know what the heck he meant. By 1975, everyone figured, right, well, gold's not part of the monetary system anymore. No reason to keep on having it be illegal. They re-legalized it. And they said, let there be a futures market. Let gold trade alongside frozen orange juice and pork bellies. Gold will drop to $7 an ounce, and by which some economists, probably the father of the idiot who's now working for Trump, saying that tariffs can never do any harm, probably his father or grandfather said, calculated, economists like to calculate things, like they have physics envy, calculated that gold would be $7 an ounce because of its electronics and jewelry, demand at that time. And of course, the moment they freed it up, and the moment the US at that time was suppressing the price of gold by selling gold, the London gold pool, the UK was selling a lot of gold. The price of gold didn't drop. It rose pretty sharply through the 1970s. By 1980, it hit over $800 an ounce from the 35 that they had pegged it at for all those decades. I don't think there's anything policy-wise that can make gold, people stop valuing gold. And if you look at gold's physical and economic characteristics, it's the one thing that works as money. Not only better than every other thing, but better by far. It's not even remotely close. And I could go on and on and on about this, and I have a lot of writings that do, in fact, go on and on about this. On goldstandardinstitute.us, if you click on classroom, there's two articles, one on gold's physical characteristics and one on economic characteristics that talk about what makes gold special. And I don't think that specialness is going to change.
Or Ayn Rand Center UK live events and hybrid events that are going to be in front of a live audience and screened on our channel are coming. An announcement of one of those is coming in the next few days. You should be signed up to our mailing list. That's the only place you'll get that announcement. So yeah, you're probably not signed up to any mailing list that sends fewer emails than us. Yeah, these are events you'll want to see. They're not just in London and not just in the UK. So make sure you're signed up. And Of course, these events are usually free to attend. Most of our content is free to watch on YouTube. None of it is free for us to produce. So if you value it, consider becoming a member. There is a link for that in the chat as well. Keith, where can people find more from you?
My company is monetary-metals.com. My personal at Real Keith Wiener. That's an EI in both names. And yeah, there's trolls and imposters that create fake Keith Wiener accounts. They either misspell my name or whatever, but at Real Keith Wiener.
And for people who are saying that link doesn't work, we'll work on that. But you can find that on our website. I think at the bottom of every page. But we'll try to fix that right now. Thanks everybody for watching. Thanks everybody for attending, and thank you very much, Keith, for today's talk. We're back tomorrow on the channel with the Daily Objective and the reality show, and we're back with live events. We'll tell you when and where after we go off the air. Thanks.